Okay, welcome back to Block 2 of the Roots of Government unit from Dark to Light. Block 2 is going to be all about how we kind of are going to start going through that cycle of government again. It's from Dark to Light because we're kind of go from the Dark Ages where there wasn't a whole lot of learning going on because aftermath of the Roman Empire falling to eventually the Light, which we're going to get into the Enlightenment, which is this period of great learning. And we're going to see how some new ideas come along in the as we learn about government. So here we go. Let's jump in to our first slide. This first slide is just a quick recap of what we went over last time. So what is government? We hopefully know that government's the structure, the groups that make the rules, the people that enforce it, including the police or the army. And also government starts to become this idea of deciding what's fair or unfair. We're also going to get a little bit, as these blocks go on, into the role of wealth in government and how that can start to have a pretty big impact as well. So, when we left off, we talked about Caesar had taken total control and essentially created a dictatorship or an authoritarian government in Rome. And that's kind of not necessarily the beginning of the end for Rome, but it certainly is kind of the downward spiral for Rome after that happens. There is a big chunk of time where you had some kind of benevolent rulers, emperors in there. Like if you want to do some research on the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, he served during this time of peace during the Roman Empire. But eventually, some of the corruption and concentration of power just lead to bad things. If you ever research like Nero or Caligula, you'll see kind of how bad things got. But eventually, you go from the people having this dictatorship to eventually Rome ends up falling. And there's a lot of reasons why Rome falls. But the main thing you need to know is that when this happens, Rome goes from basically being a dictatorship to now all of a sudden when Rome burns around 500 AD and it falls, you go back to anarchy again. And you have this brief moment of anarchy where it's basically every man for himself. It's a very like dark anarchy, and it lasts for kind of a chunk of time until, leading to our next slide, you start to go back to an authoritarian figure taking back the power. In this case, it was a king by the name of Charlemagne. Charlemagne essentially kind of was a king. He had a monarchy, and he took control. The main thing you need to know about him is that he ruled during this period known as the Dark Ages. And they were called the Dark Ages because there wasn't a whole lot of learning going on. Basically, Charlemagne and these kings and their people underneath them had all the power, and the people didn't have a whole lot of wealth or power underneath them. So it was great for Charlemagne and his crew, but it wasn't great for the people kind of like we've seen before. But then, slowly things start to change. One of the things that starts to change is that this is after Charlemagne, but there was a king afterward known as King John. And he had a group of his lords that all of a sudden kind of ganged up on him, and they kind of, in a way, tricked him, where they basically are like, things are going to go really bad for you if you don't give us a little bit of power. And so when they asked for this little bit of power, the king eventually kind of backed down and ends up giving it to it. So King John gives up a portion of power, and this happens in 1215. I'll put on Google Classroom a pretty hilarious clip if you want to check out the Magna Carta rap. It's pretty funny, but the one thing I would point out is that essentially when Charlemagne has all the power over here and the nobles convince King John to give up a tiny little bit of his power, you go from it being essentially autocratic to essentially moving back towards this kind of idea of limited government. So it's kind of a step back and moving towards away from or towards what we would call a more limited government. One of the things that kind of kicked off this movement towards light, or this movement towards learning, was a period known as the Renaissance. It was literally rebirth in Italian. So it was a rebirth of learning, and it started off kind of in the artistic world also with government and architecture, but kind of going back to not necessarily doing a whole lot of stuff with like religion in the Bible, but more going back to the ancient Greeks and Romans and studying what they used to do, kind of dusting off the old books. I always give the example of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment is they essentially get the old Roman books out and they're like, what were these guys doing again? Because you got to understand, during the Dark Ages, this was like a period of 100 years where it essentially went back to basics. Like we're talking No plumbing, no running water. People were dirt poor. Just wasn't the best time to be alive. And the governments were essentially like these monarchies. So all of a sudden you have people that start like getting back into learning again. And we're like, let's dust off these old books. And like dust flies everywhere. And they started learning and being like, hey, these guys actually had some pretty good ideas. So that's kind of, it starts with the Renaissance. And then eventually it starts to spread to the time period a little bit later known as the Enlightenment. Another interesting bright spot is in Italy there was actually two small republics that kind of came out, or representative democracies. There was one in Florence and one in Venice. So it's weird that surrounded by all this like monarchies and authoritarian governments, you actually had these little mini republics pop up. They eventually kind of went away, but it is interesting to see that since the kind of Renaissance happens in Italy and you have like this learning that's discovered, all of a sudden you have these two little pockets of democracy that break out. Kind of like moving towards this limited government again. It's kind of like a little fizzle though. They end up going away, but it is kind of like people start talking about it again. Why don't we maybe start thinking about changing our government, moving to a better kind of government? Machiavelli is a figure that was from Florence. He wrote a famous book called The Prince. This book was kind of a would-be guide to any rulers. It was mostly like geared towards like a king or a queen. But really the book gets at like what makes an effective leader, and what they should be doing. So if you ever hear somebody talking about The Prince, it's kind of like this would-be guide to how to be an effective ruler. And he definitely gets to the idea that effective rulers aren't always maybe making the nicest decisions in the world. Sometimes they have to be a little ruthless and whatnot. So that quote, if you've ever heard it, the quote is, would you rather be feared or loved? Machiavelli definitely said you'd rather be feared. And he said his rationale was, it's much safer to be feared than loved because fear preserves you as a dread of punishment which never fails. Basically, he's saying that if you're a ruler, you might want to think about having people fear you because that fear is going to last longer and be more powerful. People just to love you for the sake of loving you. All right. So the Enlightenment, mentioned this earlier, we're going to get into it right now. It was known as an age of reason and an age of just going back and dusting off the old Greek and Roman books. It started really getting into just philosophy, learning, is what are the best ways of doing government, so on and so forth. And it really started to challenge the autocratic rule. Basically, let's just take this guy here. I'm just going to kind of pretend what I think you would say. So you pretend that I'm that dude. So he might say something like, why do we have to follow these kings like Charlemagne or King John? Why don't we go back to what they did in ancient Rome and create a new republic, a new and improved republic? Who thinks that's a good idea? And all these people during the Enlightenment are just like, yeah, I kind of like this on it. Here, look at this little dude right here. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Papa, is it true? Could there be a government that's not an autocratic king? Oh, I don't know. That's a dangerous idea. Mate, should we really be talking about this? I say we should talk about this because it's very important. Why do we have to follow kings? Let's try a new type of republic right here in Europe. What did you think about that little impersonation with the picture I just did here? I hope you enjoyed it. Anyways, that's exactly what starts to happen. People start to question autocratic rule. Do we really have to have kings and queens? Or is there not a better way to do things? So before I get any further, an idea that comes up during the Enlightenment is this idea of a social contract. A social contract is basically where citizens agree to give up some freedom in exchange for their safety. You can kind of see these two guys in the picture doing this. Not too sure what's going on with this handshake here. A little bit of weird, didn't quite line up. If you're at all confused by social contract, it's easy breezy. If you remember at the beginning of class this year, or any of your classes, a social contract was essentially when you heard the classroom shared vision and code of conduct, and then you basically agreed and signed it. So if you agreed to give up some of your freedom in exchange for safety, just like at the beginning of the year, you agreed to give up certain times when you wanted to talk, and you had to give up maybe like your cell phone at times, but you know that in exchange you're going to get a safe learning environment. There you go. That's what a social contract is. Most people agree that you have to agree to be in the social contract for it to apply to you. So, if we look, one of the very first thinkers who talked about the social contract during the Enlightenment was this gentleman right here. His name is Thomas Hobbes. He was from England. He believed that anarchy was bad. He called it the state of nature, and he believed the only way you could stop the bad things from happening in a state of nature, like people stealing from you or trying to kill you. He basically made it sound like in a state of nature, you're always looking over your back and you're always worried, like, is that guy going to kill me? Is that person trying to steal from me? He thought that that was no way to live in a society, so he felt like people should have a social contract where they agree to give up some of their freedom, aka the freedom to kill people and steal from people, in exchange to get safety. So he was the first person that thought that a social contract should be a part of government. Now, he thought the best type of government was a monarchy, and that was the best option, but he thought the monarchy should include a social contract. So if the king wasn't keeping you safe and the king wasn't protecting you, he believed the people had the right to take back the power from the king and have what we would call, I guess, a revolution, where you change or take back the power. So this idea kind of starts to move. The idea of it, Hobbes had this kind of government, but he never necessarily saw the government with a social contract. You could see that it starts to move government away from authoritarian and back towards this limited government. And this really gets taken a step further with this gentleman right here with his lovely locks of hair. John Locke was also from England. He also believed in social contract, but he did not believe in a monarchy. John Locke had this idea where a social contract would include these things called natural rights. Things like your right to life, liberty, and you being able to own your own private property. Now, when John Locke came up with these ideas, he really felt like these would probably have to happen in a democratic system of government where the people have the power and people's natural or God-given rights are protected by the government. So if the government couldn't protect your things like your right to life or your right to freedom or your right to your private property, he felt like, again, the citizens should get rid of it. And the Founding Fathers really liked kind of some of the ideas that he came up with. His ideas really truly kind of got at this idea of having a very limited government where the government has to protect your life, your liberty, which is kind of new, and your private property. And we're going to see how that comes up again when we start talking about the founding of the United States. So John Locke was another Enlightenment thinker, and he really kind of moved the people's thinking towards the benefits of a limited government that protects natural rights. All right. Another key guy was Baron de Montesquieu. He was a French guy, right? Hence the name Montesquieu. Every time I say it, it just makes me so happy. So Baron de Montesquieu was a French philosopher, and he really studied the fall of the Roman Empire, and he basically was like, look at one John Locke ideas. Let's say you do a new republic, and let's say it protects your natural rights. What are you going to do if another Caesar-type character comes along and takes back power? How can you stop a Caesar-like person from taking back the power? How can you prevent tyranny or tyrannical types of government from happening? And his idea that he had was new, that the Romans never necessarily came up with, was to take positions of power in a democracy and to split them up into different separate areas. This idea was known as basically separation of power. And he thought that that was the key to preventing another Caesar from coming along and taking the power. So again, he had a way of basically an idea to get away from one person having all the power and keeping it that way. So his addition, or what he added, was keeping power limited, and once it's there, you could prevent a tyrant from taking over by separating power. Now, what does that look like? We'll talk more about that in the next block. But as long as you know that that was his key contribution, you'll be in good shape. So Baron de Montesquieu, preventing tyranny by separating power. Another big, this is when actually they start to take some of these ideas and kick them in, is the English Bill of Rights. In 1689, you had essentially the people in Parliament come to the king at the time and say, we want more power. We want you to protect our individual rights. One example is cruel and unusual punishment. So they did not think that the king should be able to use any kind of cruel and unusual punishment. So similar to Magna Carta, they basically approached the king. They were like, we want these rights protected, and it was agreed upon. So the English Bill of Rights come along, and all of a sudden, for the first time, you have some of these natural rights that are taken and put into place. Now, what were some of these rights? They're right here. So I don't know if you can see it. The Magna Carta gave people the right to jury by trial, the right to due process, and the right to private property. But you can see the English Bill of Rights, when it happens in 1689, it adds on these kind of ones in green. So no cruel and unusual punishment, no excessive bail or fines, the right to bear arms or to be able to have a gun, and the right to petition the government, basically to get signatures to show the government you're unhappy. So you can see this is kind of a big step in terms of creating rights for people. And some of this might even sound a little familiar if you've ever learned about early American history. And you're going to kind of get a little preview of when the America is created and we have our Bill of Rights, some of the things that get added on to that. All right, so just jumping back real quick to English Bill of Rights, it's another huge step in trying to move us to a limited government where individual rights are protected from authoritarian types of governments, and they basically protect the individual's rights within a democracy. All right. One type of democracy there's two types of governments that might come up this unit. One of them is called a parliamentary type of government. In a parliamentary type of government, it is a democracy, and in this type of government, basically you have the legislative branch and the executive branch together. Now, in the United States, we're used to them being apart, but in a parliamentary type of government or parliamentary democracy, they're together. So in parliamentary governments, a lot of times they have a figure called the prime minister, and that prime minister is also a member of the legislative or lawmaking body known as the parliament. So bottom line, parliamentary governments, legislative and executive branches are like together. If you want to see a pretty funny video clip, I'll put some on Google Classroom, but you can kind of see some people arguing in British Parliament, and it's pretty amazing. There's a lot of pop, 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 or I do say order, 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 and it's pretty great, so you'll have to check that out. All right, so that's pretty much it. This is the last type of government. It's a type of government known as a theocracy. Just by chance this happens to come up, you'll be able to see and hopefully know what it is. So a theocracy is rule by religion. So if there's ever a religious group that is in charge, that's what a theocracy is. So here you can see the Pope in Vatican City speaking and representing a big chunk of Christianity, the Catholic Church. That would fall under as a theocracy. In Iran, you have a figure known as the Ayatollah, and he helps rule Iran under Islamic principles. This would be a much more violent kind of rule by religion, but this would be ISIS, right? ISIS would also be a theocracy, a much more violent type of theocracy, but they are ruled based on principles of religion. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully you have a better idea of how progress has been made in terms of different governments and the different government types are. So that's pretty much it. Thanks so much for being a part of the video. We'll see you next time. Okay, bye.